Bonjour à toutes et à tous. On a le plaisir d'accueillir Rachel Bezner Kerr, qui vient de Cornell University, qui a beaucoup travaillé au Malawi sur la relation entre agroécologie et sécurité alimentaire et nutrition, qui est en séjour trop court chez nous, parce qu'elle repart dans une semaine. Et donc je la remercie d'avoir accepté de présenter à nouveau aujourd'hui, parce que hier on l'a sollicité dans un colloque à l'autre bout de Montpellier dans un programme CIRAD, et donc elle va nous faire aujourd'hui une autre présentation différente, plus tournée sciences sociales, sur son expérience de recherche-action au Malawi, qui vise à modifier un certain nombre de pratiques agricoles dans la perspective d'améliorer la sécurité alimentaire et la nutrition des enfants. Donc Rachel va faire son intervention en anglais, mais vous pourrez l'interroger en français et elle vous répondra en anglais. Comme ça met tout le monde à l'aise pour discuter. Is it okay?
That's
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me to give a presentation. It's a very nice opportunity. And today I'm going to try to give a brief overview of some of the work we've been doing in Malawi for the last 14 years, but I'm going to focus on our most recent work on climate change adaptation, because we've been doing that for the last 4 years, and I'm in the midst of trying to write up some of that work. So I'm going to briefly talk about why Malawi is an interesting place to do this kind of research. And then I'm going to talk about some of my own sociological research on some crops that have been lost and found in Malawi. And I will briefly talk about some of our work on climate change perceptions in northern Malawi, and then talk about our long-term agroecological work with a focus on climate change adaptation. And hopefully all of this can be done with plenty of time for questions. So the dominant mode of agriculture, which you're all familiar with, is that of use of fertilizer, hybrid seeds, and it's intensive agriculture with mechanization. And this mode of agriculture is being heavily promoted right now, and I should say alongside increased global market integration. That's a key component of this mode of agriculture. And it's being increasingly heavily advocated by the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, spearheaded by the Gates Foundation. Agroecology, for those of you not familiar with the term, takes a different approach to agriculture that is more holistic and tries to use biological processes to have recycling of nutrients within your farming system, to minimize soil and water loss, and to take advantage of synergies and biological interactions to reduce pest problems and disease and weed problems. Malawi, as some of you may know, it's in southern Africa. It's not Mali that I'm working, but Malawi. Malawi has been really pushing the first approach for the last 7 years, longer than that really, but it hit the international headlines in the last 7 years or so because the president went against what the international community was telling him to do and reinstituted a fertilizer and hybrid maize seed subsidy for the majority of smallholder farmers in the country. Malawi is and this hit the news because he then claimed that food security problems had been solved and that they were a hungry, free nation. And that was really taken up and celebrated internationally for a number of years. If you follow this at all, you may notice it's now gone quiet. That's because the country went into a tailspin of a financial crisis and a political crisis as the president increasingly suppressed dissent and shot 19 people who were protesting about the financial and political situation in the country. So he was no longer the darling of the international community. And then he died and a new president took over who wasn't using the fertilizer subsidy in the same political way that that president was. And the country is still struggling with a very serious financial crisis and has had to devalue its currency and is essentially going through another round of structural adjustment. So it's a tough time. So it's no longer being celebrated, but nonetheless, it's still brought up in agricultural circles as a miracle, and both in writing and in if you go to meetings in Africa, it's often brought up by agricultural scientists as a very positive example of addressing food security, which is one of the reasons why it's an interesting place to compare these two approaches. Malawi still experiences very high rates of food insecurity. About 1/3 of the population still experiences annual rates of food insecurity. And the soils in Malawi are largely deficient of nitrogen, so it does require some sort of nitrogen source in order to get adequate yields from maize, which is the primary staple crop there. Maize makes up about 60% of all area grown to crops and all food consumed. In relation to climate change, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, what's predicted for Malawi is increased instability of rainfall, reduced precipitation overall. When you do get precipitation, increased flooding experiences, and an overall reduction in agricultural yields. And Malawi is also a place where people still do hand-hoed agriculture, and women do more than half of all agricultural labor. So it has interesting dimensions that way as well. And it has high rates of HIV/AIDS. About 11% of the population, the adult population, that's the current prevalence, estimated prevalence of HIV/AIDS. So that's an additional challenge, which brings about additional labor constraints, not only taking a sick person out of the farming production, but requiring additional care and additional nutrition for that person. So that's an added dimension that we've included in our study. It's something you can't ignore. So that's a bit of background to the region, to the place. Now, I've been working in Malawi since 1997, but this recent, and I've been working with a hospital since 2000 on a participatory research project. So I'm going to use the word we because it's not research that I've done on my own, but it's very much collaborative, interdisciplinary, and participatory. In the last 4 years, we've done this research on climate change adaptation in which we tried to understand what have some of the historical cropping practices been in Malawi, what can we learn from those practices, and what are farmers currently perceiving to be happening to their climate, and what strategies are they interested in taking to adapt to climate change. And so both looking back and looking forward using a participatory approach. In my own work, I've used the theoretical approach of feminist political ecology, which is trying to understand gender as a key social relation that affects inequality, but also other social relations such as class and kin as being important for understanding how inequality is shaped, and the intersection between environmental factors and political factors in shaping that inequality, and looking at these things at different scales. Okay, so the research I'm going to report on now was multi-method. We did in-depth interviews, some historical research looking at the archives and oral history with older people in the community, and several large, well, not large by some standards, some standard surveys, one that was 200 households and another which was 800 households. And then 4 years of doing experiments with 400 households that were selected. They volunteered, but they were selected based on criteria of heightened vulnerability, so highly food insecure, or HIV positive person in the home, and/or someone who is youth. And with that group of 400 households, we also did a pre and post survey, the beginning of their experiments and the end of their experiments. So the first part I'm going to talk about is these lost and found crops. And this research was really largely my own research, and I just had a paper come out in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, which summarizes this work. One of the things I learned was that sorghum used to be grown in this area, and sorghum is an indigenous grain to Malawi, and it had essentially disappeared from the landscape. Only a handful of people in the region growing sorghum. Finger millet, which is pictured here, had not disappeared. It's another indigenous grain. Both of them are more drought tolerant than maize. And so in the historical record, so explorers who were traveling through this region in the 1800s described a cropping system where, first of all, people were highly food secure. They had a diverse range of crops, but they also grew both sorghum and millet as part of that cropping system. And this explorer said they had so much that they were giving it away to passersby because they weren't going to be able to eat it all. Now, you have to take their description with a grain of salt, obviously, but the higher levels of food security was a common description by people working in and traveling in this area at the time. Now, when the British took over Malawi in the late 1800s and began to take control or try to change the cropping system, they had a particular dislike for finger millet. At the time, finger millet, and still, was grown by taking forested land, clearing it, and burning it, and then broadcasting finger millet. And finger millet was considered to grow best on newly cleared forest land. So it was part of a shifting cultivation system. And the British loathed that practice, partly because finger millet was used for the production of beer. And at the time, there were communal work parties. So you would invite people over, they would help you clear the land, you would cook up a big pot of beer, they would drink the beer, either during or after the work was done. And that was a big part of how labor was carried out in this part of Malawi. Missionaries did not like this practice because of the excessive beer drinking. And the British didn't like it. Missionaries were Scottish. And the English colonial power didn't like it because they saw it as being very terrible, very degrading for the land because of the burning. And so they took on a campaign starting in the early 1920s to eliminate the production of finger millet. And so this, and they blamed it on sort of useless natives who don't understand, they don't understand the environment. So this quote here, the growing of this millet is generally responsible for a great deal of accelerated shifting, loss of fertility in the land, and serious erosion. Propaganda and education should be extensively applied with the object of reducing, and if possible, suppressing cultivation of finger millet under the wasteful methods involving soil burning and constant shifting. The evils of the system are recognized by many of the more intelligent natives. So I thought that was a fascinating quote. And that campaign continued, excuse the racism, that is, I apologize on their behalf. I don't support that view at all. But that campaign continued and became actually very active in the 1940s and the 1950s, including jailing people who were growing finger millet. And I came upon a list of people who were jailed in the 1950s in Ekwendeni, in the region where I work, because they were doing this practice. Interestingly, it was maintained, and it was maintained despite active efforts under the colonial regime and the post-colonial regime. The post-colonial regime was a dictatorship, a man called Kamuzu Banda, who also disliked millet and pushed maize very heavily through state subsidy of maize seed distribution and through propaganda campaigns and very active efforts to push maize as the primary staple. Nonetheless, finger millet persisted. And when we did surveys in 2010, we found, and 2011, 2012, between 10 and 25% of people were growing finger millet in any given year. But we also asked whether people had abandoned any of their crops, and 13% of people said they had abandoned finger millet. So it was being dropped from the cropping system by some people. And when we pursued this question, why are people abandoning millet, one of the common answers has to do with tobacco. Tobacco used to be a crop that could only be grown by people who had large areas of land. By law, you had to be a large landholder. But that was changed under structural adjustment efforts to promote export promotion. That law was dropped and smallholders could grow tobacco, and it was taken up in a very big way in the north. And it's very labor intensive, far more labor intensive than other crops grown in the area. And when you sell tobacco, it's sold by the household, and usually men control the proceeds from the sale. Whereas beer production is often done by women, and women often control the income from beer production. And so women said they could not control the labor associated with finger millet. Men had to clear the land because men own land in the north. Land is passed through men, from father to son, and cutting down trees is considered a male task because of that ownership and because they're considered to be stronger than women. And so women said things like, tobacco has taken over from millet. Men pay too much attention to tobacco. I can't get my husband to help me grow millet. In addition, the forest was being cut for tobacco. It requires a lot of wood for curing. And so there wasn't that forest land that you could clear to grow millet. So there was an environmental factor as well. So this woman is actually broadcasting finger millet. She's preparing the land to broadcast finger millet. So this is a quote from one of my interviews. Finger millet is a problem because you need to have a husband who is willing to remove the trees and clear the area. So for me, it's like an extra job. I can't manage it. And so in this paper, I argue that it was a confluence of factors because people also talked about rising HIV rates and the additional care required for looking after sick people in their homes. So they couldn't allocate labor to finger millet under those conditions. So it was a combination of the promotion of tobacco as a cash crop, which was part of structural adjustment policies, so political factors at the national level, combined with gender relations at the household level, and this environmental factor of lower land availability that's forested land that has been leading to declining millet production. Now, what about sorghum? Sorghum was a crop that used to be grown 100 years ago. Even 2 generations ago, people remembered their grandmothers used to grow sorghum, but it had disappeared. It used to be grown as a backup crop. If maize failed, we had sorghum, because you can use sorghum to make beer, but also to make sima, the main the main staple. But in our survey, we found about 2% were growing it. So it disappeared. People didn't even know that it was edible. If you ask them about sorghum, some of them wouldn't know the name of sorghum. So it was very interesting. It really had been forgotten. Why was it forgotten? This is a question that I became really interested in. Well, some people said it had to do with watching the sorghum. Birds like sorghum, and they found that to be they didn't have time for that, so they were preferentially allocating their labor to other activities. And with increasing primary school enrollment, you couldn't get your kids to watch out for the birds. And as fewer and fewer people are growing sorghum, you have more birds going to a given field. So it's a kind of environmental factor as well. People said it's kind of a backwards crop. That was the crop we grew at the time of our grandmothers, and we're modern now. This isn't a modern crop. Other people said, our hearts were in maize. We loved maize. We love maize. But people also talked about the government's hand in promoting maize and not saying overtly don't grow sorghum, but just saying grow maize through policies, through propaganda campaigns, and seed distribution. And this helped to make them forget sorghum. So one person said, I'm thinking that when we were growing up, we didn't eat sorghum often. Maize was overtaking it. By and by, it disappeared. And other people talked about they linked it very directly to Banda and his promotion of maize. And that led to people forgetting it. And then once you've lost the seed and your neighbors have lost the seed, you don't even have the choice of being able to grow it again. So Here, I argue that it had less to do with gender relations at the household level and more to do with this kind of combination of policy and environmental factors that led to the decline in sorghum production. And we've also found another crop that's declining, which is local maize, a very common response when we asked what people were abandoning local maize, so land-race varieties of maize. Maize has been grown in Malawi for almost 500 years. It came in with explorers, Portuguese explorers, and with the slave trade. But people are increasingly growing hybrid maize, and this is in large part due to policies that are promoting it, distributing hybrid maize through subsidized coupons. And we found significant changes in cropping patterns as a result. Okay, so the second part of my talk is about climate change perceptions. We were interested in understanding how people perceived what was happening in their climate before we started even talking about adapting to climate change. And people talked about the rains have changed a lot. There used to be rains that would come before the main rains, and those no longer come. So they had special names, like the rain that puts out the bushfires is one of the rains, and that no longer comes. And we were able to do focus groups where we have older people and younger people, and we would ask about these rains. And the older people, so say, over the age of 30 or so, would remember those rains. Oh yes, we used to have that rain that would come in September. And the young people, the youth, wouldn't know about those rains. So it was good evidence of change that people talked about. And they also talked about greater unpredictability. You couldn't predict when the rains were going to start. You'd get breaks in the middle of the rainy season, much more than in the past. And rains would stop later, or the rains would stop earlier. They would start later, stop earlier. So a shorter rainy period. Some rains that used to come during the dry season aren't coming, and greater unpredictability of rainfall. So very dramatic changes in rainfall patterns. We also asked about their water sources, because most people rely on wells, or very few people have tapped water in rural Malawi. And the majority of people described a small decrease or a large decrease in the amount of water available throughout the year. So significant changes. Now, they weren't aware of the international discussions about climate change. They weren't exposed to those discussions, really. They had heard the term climate change starting around 2011, with the government getting increased funding for workshops and so on. The term was used in English usually, but they didn't know it related to these broader international discussions. That was news to them. What they ascribed climate change to be caused by was their own deforestation, and they often linked it to tobacco production. So they blamed themselves for the changes that they saw in the rainfall patterns. But they, alongside the rainfall, they said this had been changing their cropping patterns, that they used to stagger their planting a lot. So you would start with one crop, a few weeks later you would plant a second one, and then a little bit later on you would plant a third. And so that you would have harvesting over a longer period of time, and your food sources would last for a much longer period of time. And that has now changed, and they're now planting at the very first rains because they're worried about the rains are lasting long enough for them to harvest something. Alongside asking about rainfall patterns and their perceptions and how that had affected them, we tried to understand how these changes ranked in relation to other issues. And here we found an interesting pattern. The men would talk about poverty, the cost of fertilizer, and things like that. Women would often talk about gender issues. So you see here, spouse unfaithful and contracting HIV, or not sharing resources. We kind of lumped that all together. That's 10% of the total sample, but it was higher for women. So that's things like, my husband takes my harvest, sells it, and uses the money for beer production. Or my husband, I know he's sleeping around and I'm worried he's going to bring HIV into our home, and how will that affect me and the children? So gender relations figured very prominently as a key concern for women, overshadowing often concerns about climate change, because it has very immediate impacts on their ability to produce enough food for their household. And I'm interested in using There's a group of scholars, O'Brien and Lukashenko, who talk about the double exposure that smallholder farmers in Africa have to climate change and globalization. And I'm interested in adding a third layer, a triple exposure for women, which is the inequality, gender inequality at the household level, but at multiple levels in society in Malawi. But then a quadruple exposure because of HIV and all the complexities that brings to trying to maintain livelihoods and have a reasonable life. You see that serious health problem was the most common worry that people ranked the highest, and that is in part due to HIV, but also a largely stripped away healthcare system as a part of structural adjustment. So, you have to pay for your healthcare. So if you get malaria or other health problems, it's expensive for you and your family. So now we're on to part 3. And this was the research design for our participatory research on climate change adaptation. It was in 2 sites with 400 farmers in 20 villages. And they selected what they were going to do the experiments on. And this was in collaboration with the College of Agriculture in Malawi, as well as an NGO called Maize. And I mentioned that they were selected based on perceived vulnerability, and they did 3 years of their own experiments, and they also met monthly within their villages to talk about their experiments with other farmers. And the kinds of experiments they did ranged from soil fertility to different small income generation activities to agroforestry and crop diversification. Now, one of the common experiments they did was legume intercrops. In part, this was largely in the north, where our first site was, and in part this was because they had heard of these doubled up legume systems from our longer term work. And this is where you grow a sort of shrubby legume such as pigeon pea and a short legume such as groundnuts or soybean together in one field, and then you bury the residue after you harvest and you grow maize the following year. And that work, which we've been doing since 2000, doing participatory research with farmers on using different legume options to improve soil fertility, we've been able to show significant impact on maize yield compared to fertilizer alone or compared to no fertilizer. And we've also shown that this improves soil cover throughout the year, so you reduce soil erosion. It has it has a more stable yield impact than fertilizer, so you get more consistent yields every year. And with the improved soil structure, it allows for better uptake of water and better uptake of nutrients. So if you do use fertilizer, you use less of it, which reduces your cost. So that VCR stands for value cost ratio. So your reduced costs you have fewer costs as a farmer. And you have improved diversity in terms of your food sources, because these are edible legumes. And we tracked child growth over a 7-year period, and we showed that there was improved child growth both in terms of height and weight for age for kids whose families were participating in using these legumes and participating in participatory nutrition education activities. And so farmers were interested in trying those legumes in part because of that, knowing they had heard about it happening in other parts. We weren't working in the same villages that we'd worked in for these legumes, but they'd heard about them. But they also saw this as a good climate change adaptation strategy. And this one farmer said, the legumes help during dry spells and keep the soil fertile. After harvesting, we bury the crop residue, which helps the soil. So they're seeing it as a long-term strategy for building soil health. And if you're burying the crop residue, if you don't apply fertilizer, at least you will harvest something, as another farmer said. Okay. So a second strategy that farmers took was crop diversification. This was the most common strategy, and it ranged from sorghum. A number of farmers became really interested in experimenting with sorghum, and we saw a significant increase in the percentage of farmers who were growing sorghum in the area, as well as pigeon pea and cowpea. Cowpea is an indigenous legume that is more drought tolerant than other legumes, and a reduction, interestingly, in tobacco production. And overall, we saw an increase in crop diversity amongst the households who were doing these experiments. So a lot of people talked about crop diversity as a good strategy. This person said, I think that we're learning that we need to plant different crops because the rains are not reliable. When you have heavy rains, some crops will do well. When you have little rains, other crops will do well. So this is a very common idea that people were sharing and people were talking about. Another thing people became really interested in part because of the link they made between deforestation and climate change, was planting trees, both agroforestry trees to improve their soils and fruit trees. And so we asked at the end of the project whether they had planted any trees as a specific response to adapting to climate change. And about 80% of people said yes, they had planted trees. And there was a lot of organizing at the community level with tree planting, where they developed community tree nurseries, and then they were distributing trees throughout their community. So there was a lot of interest in tree planting. But there was also interest at the community level in other things, and this varied a lot by village. So this group of people, except for my son Isaiah, you can just see him in the back. Here, he's right there, hidden by my sign. He's being held. I'd taken the picture, so my friend Esther is holding him. But they are holding up finger millet, and what they started doing experiments with was growing finger millet in ridges rather than growing it broadcast on cleared land that had been burned, so that you could, one of the reasons people burn it and then broadcast it on cleared land is because it's hard to differentiate finger millet from weeds on land that had been under production previously. But if you grow it in ridges, they found that that worked well for being able to differentiate between finger millet and weeds. And so this group began experimenting with that method. And then they got such good results from it that they called 4 village headmen in the neighboring villages and said, do you have 10 farmers who would be interested in trying this experiment? But they have to be serious farmers if they want to get our help. And so the village headmen provided the names of 10 interested farmers from their village. And they gave them free seed and advised them as to how to grow finger millet in this different way. And then they did that a second year. So this picture was just taken in May, and that's some of their harvest from finger millet, which they were very excited about. This group did something different. They learned about how to make wood stoves using local clay, and they built this kiln. They're gathered around this kiln in their community, and they make fuel-efficient wood stoves. First, they made it for themselves because, again, of this link between deforestation and climate change. But then they also used it as an income-generating activity and began selling it more broadly in the region. But I don't want to overemphasize their ability to address these problems that are quite serious, and the broader political and economic forces working in Malawi. This is a photograph taken just near these guys. It's just neighboring them. In fact, a lot of it is their land. It's land that has been grabbed. It was initially grabbed by Banda under the dictatorship, and then and it was grown as an estate, and it's now been sold to some foreign owners. They don't know who. They don't know those owners, but they've fenced off that land. It's quite a significant amount of land, probably about 1,000 hectares, which is quite significant in a place that's very land short. And they're growing, industrial. They're growing legumes. They're growing groundnut. And they're growing soy, and they're growing maize, but they're exporting it all. So that is an example of the kind of broader political and economic forces that make it hard for farmers to maintain food security in Malawi. I'm almost done because I'm aware I'm running over my time, but I want to mention as well a little bit about our efforts around nutrition. It wasn't just that we encourage people to grow a more diverse range of crops, but also we've done a lot of work around nutrition education. And that has included having recipe days where people come together and cook different recipes that they share with each other, and both men and women. And this is kind of a roundabout way of trying to get men more involved in childcare and in feeding and in food production. And just with the group of 400 farmers that we were involved with, we've seen an increase in household dietary diversity from 3.5 to 5.2 food types eaten at the household level. And that's using this household dietary diversity score, which is a kind of standardized measure for changes in household in dietary diversity. And people also reported using new recipes, which they really enjoyed, helping them, have more enthusiasm for food. Interestingly, they also reported reduced conflict between husbands and wives as a result of greater food security and greater diversity of foods eaten in the home. So this person said, I have been for many years growing soybean and groundnuts, but at first I was just selling them. But now I've learned these recipes and my family likes the recipes. So she adds, in addition, because I'm able to prepare nice recipes from soya, it has helped my husband to be stable. He stopped from looking for other women to marry. That's quite a significant factor in your life if you're concerned that your husband is going to marry a second wife. In this part of Malawi, you can have more than one wife. So that was not an uncommon statement. It was phrased in different ways. My husband is not looking outside the home. He's not fooling around. He's not going to be bringing HIV. We're fighting less. He's drinking less. So it's not something we sought out. It was quite unexpected, but they made this connection between cooking more together, making better food that tasted better, and less conflict in the home. So we found that quite interesting. We've been able to show a significant change in food security in just 2 years using the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, which is 9 different questions on food security. From the majority of households being severely food insecure, remember we selected them based partly on that criteria, to the majority being either food secure or mildly food insecure. And so just to finish with this photograph of one of the participatory experimenters, and she is HIV positive and open about her status, and she has found the use of these different strategies to be very helpful in her own life. So she's standing in her pigeon pea and soybean field, and she's found that those legumes have helped build her strength. But also she's been in the village where they made those stoves, and she's found that helpful both for keeping her warm when she's not feeling well, but her community has kind of helped. There's been more support and more social support reported as part of the changes that they've experienced with this project. So when she's been sick, her climate change experimenters, her fellow climate change experimenters have come and helped her weed her field and so on. So one of the outcomes that we are finding is greater social support and greater community organizing as a result of this participatory research. And so we're arguing that this approach to addressing climate change adaptation using a combination of agroecology, participatory research, and attention to inequalities in the household and the community has a lot of potential for addressing food security and nutrition in the long term. And so some of the conclusions that we've drawn from our long-term work and from this most recent study is that legume diversification can support both soil and human health. And it's important to use community-led educational approaches if we want to have impact on health and nutrition. And that attention to using an agroecological approach requires investment in agroecological research, training, and support. So this is, very time-consuming work that requires a lot of support. And what we are suggesting is it's money better spent than investing in imported inputs that once you use them once, you don't have lasting impact. But in order to have lasting impact on highly vulnerable households, you now have to pay attention to the inequalities working at multiple scales. And in addition, in specific relation to our climate change research, we are advocating for basic scientific education on climate change, but one that takes into account local perceptions and understandings of climate, and using participatory methods, because there's real mismatch between what people are hearing in the discourse at the national level and what they're experiencing on the ground. And that a range of options can be provided to farming households to experiment with to match their given agroecological area and their social and their social context. So, we found some options that have potential, but we think there are likely many more. But we highlighted crop diversification, agroforestry, and overall using this agroecological approach to improve human nutrition and food security. And we had a policy meeting with government representatives in February, and we presented a sort of summary of our findings, a brief to them. And they were interested. Of course, these are all political issues, and it's an uphill battle trying to gain their attention given the outside resources that are funneling in using a very different approach. But we're working on that. So anyways, my last slide is to acknowledge that I work in a team with farmers and with hospital staff, with researchers from Michigan State, from University of Western Ontario, from Chancellor College, and that we have gotten support from the International Development Research Centre for many years in Canada, and more recently from the Government of Canada, from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development. And we've had long-term support from the Canadian Food Grains Bank, Presbyterian World Service Development, and from the McKnight Foundation. So that's been very helpful for us. And now I'm looking forward to your questions.